I'm sure. Okay. Yes, this is being recorded, evidently. So, Petra, Jordan is one of those fascinating cities, one of those dead cities. It's sort of like Machu Picchu in Peru, or Angkor Wat in Cambodia, or Atlantis at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, or the ancient lost city of Mu, which is in the middle of the Pacific. These are wonderful, fascinating lost cities. And Petra is now, of course, a tourist site, but at one particular time, it was a great, powerful, and very formative city because it thrived at the time when Judaism was passing from temple Judaism to synagogue Judaism, when Christianity was emerging, and when Islam was taking shape. Petra was a crossroads of the gods, a crossroads of many different religions. So on the picture on the right, you see the famous temple, often called the treasury, carved into the red sandstone of the mountains of southern Jordan. Well, our outline is a little bit on the history of religions. Where do religions come from? How do they evolve? To get an appreciation for the importance of Petra. The Nabataeans, people that we don't even remember anymore, but yet who carved this magnificent city and basically disappeared when the city disappeared. Found Petra, the two crucial centuries, the last century BC, or BCE, and the first century of the Christian or the Common Era. The rise of Islam and Petra today. So let's get going. So how did I end up in Petra? Well, every January, Touro College closes at about just before the Christmas holiday and Hanukkah holiday, and it stays closed for January and it reopens in early February. So to get out of the New York cold, like a lot of you guys do when you go to Florida or someplace, I go to cheapo air and I find a cheapo flight, staying in cheapo hotels and having a wonderful trip. So the January of 1998, I decided to go to India. Well, I realized a long time ago that at the age of 72, 12-hour-long flights totally demolish me. So I've taken to going halfway there, getting off the airplane, spending a couple days visiting something, and then doing the second leg of the trip. So what I did in January 1998, I left New York and I flew to Amman. And I went down to Petra and visited Amman. Then I did the second leg, which is New Delhi. We visited Agra and the Taj Mahal, Benares, Bodh Gaya, the city of the Buddha, Lucknow. Then back to Amman, and then a couple days in Amman, and then back to New York City. So that's my usual January plan. In fact, now, hopefully a new wave of COVID won't hit us, but I am already preparing my January vacation for this coming January. Well, Petra is one of those cities that really gets you thinking because it has no inhabitants. It is the ruins of an ancient city, long abandoned. Even the Nabataeans are long forgotten. So when you get to a city like that, like Angkor Wat or like Machu Picchu, or if I ever get to Atlantis, it's a kind of place where you just sit down on a big rock and you just contemplate the city. You just contemplate what actually was going on here some 2,000 years ago. Well, it got me to thinking about the origins of religions because Petra was the crossroads between Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. everything in the first century, the last century BC and the first century AD, everything was passing through this city. Ideas, people, products, everything, as well as religions. So I started contemplating, how do religions come about? How are religions born? Can't understand synagogue Judaism. You can't understand Christianity. You can't understand Islam without going to Petra and experiencing this hot pot of world religions. Well, I was carrying my usual reading with me, The Evolution of Religion by Shelby, Ritual and Religion, and of course, Karen Armstrong, my old professor at Harvard, who was talking about the history of religions. Religions are a tree. I often think when I was in Ethiopia for another one of my January vacations, and I saw Lucy. Remember Lucy, that skeleton that they found in petrified form, the oldest human person walking upright? Well, people not only evolved in Ethiopia in the Great Rift Valley, but of course, religions began. As people came down out of the trees, they started looking up and seeing thunder and lightning and wondering, what the hell is that? There must be somebody up there sending down lightning, sending down rain, sending down storms. And so they would make a sacrifice to this great god of storms. Well, one religion led to another. Religion of the ancient Ethiopians, Lucy, evolved into the great religious tree, which we see on this slide, with everything from all the forms of Christianity and Judaism, Zoroastrianism, Buddhism. They all emerged one from the other. So this is the beginning of the great tree of religion. Animism, as we call it, 100,000 years ago, millions of years ago, the Proto-Indo-Europeans, the religions of India and Europe, Mesopotamia and the Canaanites, the origins of the Semitic religions, Judaism growing out of the religions of Babylon, Christianity growing out of Judaism and the religions of the Greek and the Romans, Islam, and we could go on today. Where do the Mormons come from? What about all these crazy evangelical Christians? Well, they are part of this fascinating tree. So humans started evolving the modern form, developing civilizations. We see Egypt, 3,300 BCE, going over to various African religions, up into Babylon and the Fertile Crescent, the Indus Valley, North China, Angkor Wat, Southeast Asia, not to forget the Aztecs in Mexico and the Incas in Peru. Great civilizations, each one creating its own civilization, its own religious tradition, constantly changing, constantly evolving. Well, where does Petra fit into all of this? Well, if you look at the map on the left, you see the X almost in the middle. There is Petra. Look at the trading routes which passed through Petra in the last century BC and the first century of the Christian Common Era. Routes going over to Egypt, the ancient civilization of the Egyptians. Trade routes going up through Jerusalem, the land of Canaan, up to Antioch, Palmyra, and down to Babylon and over into Persia. And from there on to Greece and Rome. The trade routes going south, down to Mecca and Medina, down into the Arabian Sea and over to India and China. The map on the right is even more dramatic, showing Petra right in the middle of this crossroads between Rome and Byzantium to the west, Alexandria and Egypt to the west, the Middle East, Samarkand, Babylon, to the east, and the whole way over to Xi'an and China and India. So Petra was a phenomenal crossroads. Well, the people who built Petra were one of these people who rose, flourished for a couple 100 years, and then disappeared. Nobody talks about, there's no Nabataea on the map. It is basically southern half of Israel, modern day Jordan, Sinai Peninsula, and a big chunk of Saudi Arabia. So they basically took the ancient kingdom, chopped it up, and other people took over. The Nabataean language exists no longer. The Nabataean religion exists no longer. But at one time, between the 3rd century BCE to 700 AD, it was the crossroads of the world. Egyptians, Greeks, Israeli Jews, Romans, Persians, Babylonian, Ethiopians, and Arabs all lived there. It was not strange to see Indian and Chinese merchants coming through. Even merchants from Roman-controlled Spain and Italy would come down. And in many ways, you could say Petra, during these crucial years, these crucial centuries, was very much a New York of its day. You'd probably walk down the street, and on every street corner was a temple or a house of worship or a house of prayer of one particular religion or the other. On one side, it drew from the ancient culture of the Egyptians, going back thousands of years, long before there was even a Petra. But in Petra, you find inscriptions in hieroglyphs, you find statues of Egyptian gods. The Babylonians expanded and took over what is today Petra, leaving behind their culture, their gods, their religions, their traditions. So walking through the streets of Petra, you could hear ancient Egyptian, you could hear Babylonian. Stories circulated. Everybody would sit around the fire drinking tea or whatever they drank in Petra, and they would exchange stories. Stories of Adam and Eve, the flood, Noah, the Tower of Babel. All of these ancient Babylonian stories circulated. The Jews, of course, had written down their interpretations of these ancient Babylonian stories. The Tower of Babel. Where's the word Babel come from? It comes from Babylon. Alexander the Great went marching through Petra, once again spreading the Greek language. In fact, the majority of the architecture of Petra is Greek-inspired architecture. And along came the Greek language, the Greek gods, the Greek mythology, the ancient stories of the ancient Greeks, and introduced Greek as the sophisticated language of educated people. And within the Greek Empire, even after Alexander, it was a stable empire. Persians, Indians would cross Persia through Babylon and stop off in Petra on their way to Egypt. The Buddhist influence on Petra was significant. Under Ashoka the Great, 312 BCE to 185 BCE, the great Buddhist empire established by Ashoka ended up with great trade routes going north through modern day Afghanistan and across to China, going into Persia, sea people leaving the coastal cities, sailing across the Persian Gulf up to the Red Sea, and stopping off in the great centers of Petra. So in Petra, you find Babylonian, Egyptian, Jewish, early Christian, as well as Buddhist influences. The great Persian Empire of the Zoroastrian religion expanded under the rule of Darius the Great. Once again, you had your Persian community in Petra. The Zoroastrians were the first monotheistic people, the first people who abandoned animal sacrifice to their gods and began to study the writings of the great prophet Zoroaster. It's again a very powerful influence on Judaism, the rise of monotheism and the passage from animal temple sacrifice to the study of the book under rabbis. Under Solomon, the great Jewish empire expanded, including Petra. Map on the left, you see the great empire of Solomon. Once again, is stretching from the Euphrates into Egypt, the biblical dream of a great, mighty Jewish empire taking over large parts of the Middle East. On the right, you see not only the Jewish empire of Israel, but the puppet states. Damascus, the kingdom of Aram, the kingdom of Ammon, the kingdom of Moab. And down in the south, Petra was made a puppet state for the empire of Solomon. So there were Jews in Petra as well as about everybody else. Of course, with the Jews came the stories of the great city of Jerusalem, the Temple of Solomon, and the Jews were writing down their sacred book, which today we call the Torah. Well, with all these people passing through Petra in the formative years of Buddhism, of Islam, of rabbinical Judaism, of early Christianity, the stories mingled. One religion influenced the other. In fact, just outside of Petra is what is claimed to be the tomb of Aaron, who was the brother of Moses. And here we see the mosque commemorating the tomb as it looks today. In fact, in the year 94 AD, the great Jewish historian Flavius Josephus wrote the Antiquities of the Jews, where he describes the importance of Petra in Jewish history and of Moses passing through Petra during his 40 years of wandering in the desert, and Aaron, the first chief priest, dying there and being buried. Out of Ethiopia came stories that profoundly mixed with the other religions of the city of Petra. The great civilizations of Ethiopia, the kingdom of Aksum, Meroe, and Aksum. When I was in Ethiopia a couple years ago, I visited these cities and saw the rich sculptural history and religious history of the Ethiopians. Ethiopian Jews did business through Petra. We have Ethiopian Jewish stories of visiting Petra, of Enoch, the Ethiopian, who was considered one of the great Jewish prophets of Ethiopian Judaism, which is very different from Western European Judaism. They have their own prophets, their own sacred books. In fact, the Ethiopian Jewish Bible is twice as long as the Bible that is used among Western Jews. The Dead Scrolls talk about the writings of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees, which were included in the Jewish Bible in Ethiopia, but excluded from the Western Jewish Bible. So the Ethiopians were in direct contact with the great civilizations of Petra. Arabs also were emerging in the last centuries BCE and the first century and started migrating to Petra, where they were put in contact with the various tribes of Jews, the early Christians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Babylonians, the Persians, and many of the ideas which became central to Islam, such as monotheism, the veneration of the book, the abandonment of animal sacrifice, and all of these were introduced to the pagan Arabs through the city of Petra. Imagine a businessman or a caravan man from what is today modern Yemen or Southern Arabia on his way to Jerusalem or to Egypt would stop off in Petra. They'd sit under a tree, they'd make a bonfire, and you would have all these different people exchanging stories. One would be a Zoroastrian from Persia, another one would be a Babylonian, another one would be a Greek, a Roman, a Jew, an Egyptian, an Ethiopian, all exchanging stories of their respective gods. And finally, the Chinese were part of this. In fact, in Petra, you still find carved statues of the Buddha. You find coins, remnants of silk garments, wood carvings from far away in Asia. You look at the picture on the right, you see the Xian, pronounced Xi'an. Spent a wonderful spring vacation there, exploring the beginning of the Great Silk Route, which went by sea down south and up to Petra, by ocean, Indian Ocean, or by land going through Khotan, Samarkand, and down into Petra. So every ancient civilization for almost 1,000 years passed through Petra. Petra was the capital of the Nabataean Empire, which basically the dates for the Nabataeans are 400 BCE to 106 AD, a brief period of 500 years where this global city rose, flourished, influenced Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and then disappeared. The book by Jane Taylor, Petra and the Lost Kingdom of the Nabataeans. We don't know anything about them. We have very little information except this magnificent city carved into the mountains that they left behind. And here we see the extent again at 880 BC, the Nabataean kingdom, Gaza, modern day occupied by Israel, Petra going up north into modern day Jordan, parts of Egypt, and the whole way down into Hejra in modern day Saudi Arabia. A brief kingdom when you look at how long the Roman, the Greek, and the Chinese and the Indian empires lasted. It was a brief, glorious moment in history. Well, I spent a couple of days there, and anybody who's visited Petra, look at the picture on the right, a narrow, winding pathway through giant mountains, and suddenly, at the end of the path, you see this magnificent red sandstone temple carved into the mountain. The temples of Petra were not built. They were carved into the face of the mountains. The only other civilization which carved its entire cities into the mountains were the Ethiopians. You visit the old cities of Ethiopia, you'll find entire churches and cathedrals carved into the front of a building, caves going in, an entire auditorium inside the door carved out of the mountain. So it was not built, it was carved. On the left is the map that you get. You see the famous visitor center. and then completely surrounded by temples. Now, a lot of these temples, we have really no idea what they were, whether they were a monument, a house of worship, a personal house. It were just hundreds of carved temples. Now, in January, even in that time, it was deathly hot. There's very little shade. The mountains take on an enormous amount of heat. So most people content themselves with viewing a few of the downtown areas, such as we see here, the Great Temple, sometimes called the Treasury. But it is completely surrounded up in the mountains by buildings that we simply don't know. Some of them may have been Turkish or Greek or Roman houses of worship, may have been ethnic neighborhoods. Many of the tombs are left unfinished. We don't know who was built there. Over on the right, you see the Crusader Fort, because with the collapse of the Nabataeans, it was absorbed by the various empires surrounding it. And at one point, the Crusaders took it over and made it into one of their secure fortresses. But some of the most fascinating stone carvings are well outside the valley where everybody goes. Sometimes you'll have to walk an hour to find such as these two magnificent carved buildings. So you go in the front door and there is a good considerable room inside. When it is so deathly hot and sun-baked, even in January, inside these mountainsides, it is pleasantly cool. I love the one on the right where they just carved away the front of a giant boulder and carved into the front a beautiful temple. The ones on the right and the left, they sort of show a very Middle Eastern type top, the stepway going down. The pillars are very often classical Greek, and the archway is also a Roman style. So even in the architecture, you see a fascinating mixture of styles. The bottom picture, an entire hillside that most people never even get up to, of temples, and we don't know what all they were, carved into the side of the mountain. Now the mountains are red. They are red sandstone. Now my father worked with sandstone in Pennsylvania, and I know a lot about sandstone. As long as it is underground and covered with dirt and exposed to periodic rainstorms, sandstone remains very soft. So it's easy to carve. But as soon as it is exposed to the sun and to the heat, it turns into a stone as hard as cement. So that is how such beautiful buildings could be carved, because the stone was still soft when they were carved. This, once again, is the main building, the 1st century AD. It is commonly called the Treasury because we have no information on what it was for sure. But here again, you see sort of a Baroque Greek architecture, a Roman little rounded tower. The facade, triangle with the 4 pillars, is pure classical Greek. Inside, you see the interior of the building, rooms carved into the stone, total darkness, only illuminated by artificial lamps. 1st century BCE, another building is the Casa Al Bint, which here again, one of the buildings which is actually constructed out of stones. It was not carved out of the mountainside. Now, this is 1st century BC. We don't really know what the function was. Most of the names given are Arabic names or sometimes Greek names, since most people have no idea what these were. There was a mountaintop sacrifice area. You see one of the gods, probably a Babylonian or maybe a god, but in the guise of a Greek god with the curled beards and curled hair. And you see the carved stones way up in the top of the mountain. So once again, tourists never go up there. You can't possibly get up there unless you drink at least a gallon of water, and most people give up the trek very quickly. But here again, the whole area around Petra is not just the valley, but completely populated with temples, with buildings that we don't even know what they were. This is one of the most monumental areas, and this is not carved out of the mountainside. It was actually constructed. This is the 1st century AD. Some people say it was an early Christian church. Some people say it was a synagogue. We have no idea, since so little has remained of the early Nabataean literature. But here again, you see these rows and rows of temple columns, very much showing almost an Egyptian influence. Typical to religious architecture is the stairways. See the stairways going from the street below, 2 flights of stairs up to a big open area. Another flight of stairs into another area. And then in the distance, there are 3 or 4 more steps up into what might possibly have been a temple of some kind. Don't forget, at the 1st century AD, Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. And as the Jews dispersed all over the world, many of them didn't accept this synagogue Judaism and Bible, but the Jews of Egypt and of Ethiopia and possibly of Petra built temples where they would gather priests from the temple. They would perform animal sacrifices just as they had done in Jerusalem. It was only much later that the synagogue Judaism predominated. The last group of Jews to sacrifice animals in their temples were the Ethiopian Jews, and they were forced to abandon the sacrifice when they were taken to Jerusalem, and they were forced to begin to worship in synagogues, causing a lot of problems with the Ethiopian Jews in Israel, saying they were stripped of their ancient culture. We do have some inscriptions. This is the Nabataean Alphabet. Some people say it's an influence of Hebrew, possibly Aramaic, Greek. Some people find signs of the early Arabic script, but a lot of this has not yet been translated. Some of it has, but it is still one of those ancient languages that we have not yet been able to master. The alphabet of the Indus Valley civilization is until today still undecipherable. We don't know what it is, but you can see it's sort of a odd looking alphabet. Some people trace it back to ancient Egyptian phonetic alphabet, but rarely do you see these inscriptions, but once in a while you will see them carved into a wall, but you really have to look for them. When the Romans occupied Petra from about 4 BC to 27 AD, they of course left their imprint on the city. And here you see a typical Roman theater with a massive seating, but behind it are the temples and even homes carved into the face of the red sandstone. So once again, almost traces of every culture can be found in Petra. On the right, you see a Roman coin, which was discovered in Petra. Now, Petra survived and thrived at a crucial period. This is one of these axis periods when a lot is happening, which will have major significance in the future. From approximately 100 BCE to 100 AD, these two crucial centuries were very important, and they're all reflected in Petra. One was the survival of Judaism. 70 AD, the destruction of the temple, the exodus of the Jews around the world. How were they going to survive? Were they going to pray in synagogues and have rabbis and have books? Are they going to rebuild temples and have priests and sacrifice animals? What is going to be the official text of the Jewish Bible? Is Hebrew and Aramaic going to survive or not? This was happening in these crucial centuries. Christianity by 100 AD was already taking root, but you had an Egyptian style of Christianity. You had a Roman and a Greek style of Christianity. You had the Jerusalem style of Christianity. You had Babylonian Syriac Christianity. What kind of Christianity was going to survive? And you had 100 AD, the rise of the Arabs starting to study the great religions of the world, Zoroastrianism, Hinduism, Judaism, Christianities, Greek, Roman, and Egyptian religions. And they were beginning to fashion their own new religion, which would eventually become known as Islam. So you can say that Petra was crucial in establishing the three great religions of the world as we know them today. With the destruction of Jerusalem, the Jews scattered around the world. Petra was one of the places going into Egypt, going up into Greece, Mesopotamia, even the first Jews in Morocco, Spain, and what is today Great Britain. Each group trying to survive. What language will they use? How will they worship? Temples or synagogues? What will be the book they use? What books will be included? What books will be excluded? Also, you had the rise of Jewish kingdoms in Arabia. When many of the Jews, we think of the Jews going to Spain, the Sephardic Jews. We think of Jews going to Europe, becoming the Ashkenazi Jews. But large numbers of Jews fled south into the Arabian world. And they established various kingdoms. In the year 380, they had the Himyar kingdom in Yemen. They had the Semian kingdom. They had the Jewish kingdom in Ethiopia. When the Jews of Ethiopia got so powerful under the leadership of Queen Judith, they seized power and they forced the majority of the Ethiopians to convert to Judaism. She was eventually overthrown and murdered, and the Jews were persecuted, and Christianity returned as the religion of Ethiopia. But the Jewish influence from Petra and further south was very important, sort of a chapter in Jewish history that is rarely studied these days. The Jews of southern Arabia, of course, were not synagogue people. They were building temples where they would sacrifice animals. The Beta Israel Falasha in Ethiopia had their magnificent temples. In fact, the temple in Egypt on the island of Elephantine in the middle of the Nile was claimed to be even bigger than the Temple of Solomon. And on the holidays, more animals were sacrificed in Egypt than had ever been sacrificed in Israel itself. Various Christian groups were present in Petra. Now, when we think of Christians today, we think of Orthodox in Russia and Greece. We think of Catholics in Western Europe and Protestants. Well, in the first century, the Christian world was much richer. There were Christians from Jerusalem, headed by Bishop Patriarch James, who was profoundly influenced by Judaism because he was a Jew. And he insisted that Christians should be circumcised. They should pray in the synagogues. They should learn Hebrew, that Jesus was a great Jewish prophet, not a separate new religious founder. You had the Christians in Egypt who had their own traditions, their own pope, and they preserved the ancient language of the pharaohs as their liturgical language, which they still use today. If you want to hear ancient Egyptian, go to an Ethiopian church here in New York. You had the Babylonian Christians, their own kind. Plus, you had the first Greek Christians coming down from the Byzantine Empire, and you had the first Roman Christians, later on to become Catholics. They were all present in Petra. And on the right, you see the famous Ridge Church, again, outside the city on a mountain built of stone, and it has Christian mosaics dating from the 3rd century, carved crosses in the wall, showing a very strong Christian presence. So in Petra, there was not one dominant form of Christians. We tend to, like I said, we're used to the Roman Catholics and the Greek Orthodox and all these Protestants, but the Egyptian Coptic Church is still alive. The Ethiopian Christians, Iraqis, the Syrian church in Iraq still worships in the language of Jesus, which was Aramaic. Historians, Armenians, Georgians, Syriac, Aryan Christians, Judeo-Christians from Palestine, and each one developed its own theology. How were God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Ghost going to be squeezed into one God? Many religions said that Jesus was simply a prophet, was not a God. Each religion had its own bishops or patriarchs or popes. What was the role of Mary in this new religion? Each of the religions had monasteries in the area lying around Petra. You heard a cacophony of languages in the various Christian churches: Aramaic, Latin, Greek, Coptic, Gaiz, an ancient dead language of Ethiopia, various kinds of worship. And so Petra was really a melting pot of ancient religions. Jews practicing both animal sacrifice and those Jews sticking to the synagogue and rabbis, various forms of Christians from all over the world, pagans from the south, holding their sacred city of Mecca and Medina, which were already sacred cities to the pagan Muslims, a blending of architecture and everything else mixing together in this melting pot of the ancient religions of the world. There were Egyptian monasteries devoted to St. Anthony and St. Paul of Thebes. So you had Christian monasteries surrounding the city in the valley. And that's the thing. When you visit Petra, don't stick with the usual tour guide, seeing all the magnificent buildings in the valley, but spend a couple of days and go up into the mountains and explore. It was very safe when I was there. I never had a problem because there was a small town nearby where you can get lodging. It's not elegant, but most people simply do a one-day quickie trip just to say they were in Petra. But if you spend a couple of days and you really absorb the uniqueness, it is really a fascinating experience. Petra reminded me a lot of the stone-carved churches, such as Lalibela in Ethiopia, When Queen Judith was overthrown and the Jews were removed from power, the Christians came back to power, and to celebrate their victory, they established the city of Lalibela with its magnificent carved churches. Now, unlike Petra, which is an abandoned city, Lalibela has a large town around it, and it is still a vibrant religious center. On the right, you see me standing, and across in the distance, that's the roof of the church, which you see on the right. So it was not built, it was carved out of the mountain, like the churches and the other buildings of Petra. The Christian Byzantines left a very profound mark. This is a Byzantine church, once again, outside the city, up on a mountaintop, but meticulously preserved mosaics showing all of the different animals of the ancient world. And as you can see, it is now well protected by a roof, and the archaeologists are constantly discovering new buildings in this abandoned city. So every kind of Christian somehow made its way to Petra. And this mixing of all the different forms of Judaism of the time. You even had Jewish monasteries in Petra, similar to those found in the Jordan Valley, where you had celibate Jewish monks. The only other place that had Jewish monasteries was in Ethiopia, where you had monks, Jewish monks living in monasteries, not married, out and meditating, like the Qumran caves that were destroyed by the Romans. But Jewish monasticism, like temples, flourished in Petra and in Egypt. Well, all of these mixing of religions into this big pot, all of these forms of Christianity, early Christianity, all these competing forms of Judaism, all of the teachings of the Buddha of China, of the pagan Arabs to the south, of the Byzantine, the Romans, the Greeks, the Zoroastrians, all started mixing together, and religious leaders started emerging. They called themselves prophets and teachers. And out of this came not only the modern form of Judaism that we know today, and the modern forms of Christianity, the Greek Orthodox and the Roman Catholic and the Egyptian and Ethiopian Christianities, but a whole new religion emerged in this hot pot of religious ideas. And this religion came to be known as Islam. Islam taught that the Prophet Muhammad was the last prophet sent by God. The first prophet was drawn from Judaism, was Adam. Then came Enoch and Noah. And then Abraham was a great prophet. Hud, Lot, Sa'ib were great prophets of the Arab peoples. Salih was a great prophet of the Arabs. Other prophets grew out of this. From Abraham, you had Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Jonah, going the whole way down to David, Solomon, John the Baptist, and Jesus. So you have this mixing of all these religions, and from that came this Jewish mixture of Jewish, Christian, and pagan chain of prophets, with Muhammad being the last of the prophets. Well, this new religion sort of picked and chose from all of the religions thriving in Petra and south in the Arab world. It is even believed that the Prophet Muhammad, on one of his many journeys, went through Petra on his way up to Syria and Iraq. Well, The Prophet Muhammad accepted monotheism of Judaism. He rejected the three gods of the Christians. He accepted the Jewish and the Christian holy books. And he accepted the Christian universal monotheistic message and rejected the tribalism of the Jews, saying that this new religion was for everybody. It was not just for one race or one group of people. It was strict monotheistic. In fact, in the Quran, they reject the notion of three gods, saying, how can there be three gods in one? So out of this morass of religions, movements, came a brand new religion. And here we see some of the great travel routes going from southern Arabia up to Petra, and then from there to Rome and Greece and up into Jerusalem, Syria, and trade routes coming from India and Iran up overland to Petra. And the Prophet Muhammad, his profession before he became a prophet, was a caravan leader. He was an orphan and he traveled with his uncle. And many people say that he went north. Some argue he even went to Jerusalem or up to Damascus, passing through Petra, which was the main crossroads of the time. And I can imagine the Prophet Muhammad sitting down, talking with rabbis of various forms of Judaism, talking with priests of various forms of Christianity, meeting Ethiopian priests, meeting Orthodox, Russian, Greek, who knows who he ran into in this melting pot of world religions, very much like New York is today, a different house of worship on every street corner. In fact, there are stories in the Quran. The one is called the Dwellers of the Cave. And it was one that is called the Cave Story, where on one of his voyages, Prophet Muhammad was fleeing into a cave. And there they say he had one of his first experiences with God, where Prophet was praying to God, and it was in the cave outside of Petra that he had this event. Historians have not proven that this was the cave outside of Petra, but Muslims believe that it was near Petra. And Islam began to emerge. Well, Mecca and Medina were kept as the sacred cities. The Kaaba, which you see in the middle, a giant room made out of stone, which was filled with the idols of the Arab tribes. Prophet Muhammad went in, destroyed all of the idols, and said, there is only one God, and now this will be a house of the one and only God, not the gods of the idols. The Arabic language emerged as the sacred language of Islam, and the Caliphate. Prophet Muhammad is considered the founder of the Caliph, strongly influenced by the emperor of the Byzantine Empire, where he encountered the Byzantines in his travels. And so Petra was really a crucial city with the expansion of the newly emerging Muslim empire. If you look at the map on the right, you see the Byzantine Empire, which was the ruling area, the ruling empire of the Middle East. See the Persian Empire on the right, the yellow. South of that, you see what is today Saudi Arabia. You see the various tribes. One of the larger tribes were the Ghassanids. The Arabs were right on the border with the Eastern Roman Empire. The goal of the rising Muslim empire was to break through from the Arab Peninsula and reach the Mediterranean. Well, the key to their expansion was the city of Petra. On this map on the left, you see the dark and the light green showing how far the Prophet Muhammad had expanded his empire. Well, the goal was to conquer what is today Jerusalem, Gaza, the land of Canaan, the land of Israel, or Palestine. That was their goal. Well, in October 630 AD, the Prophet Muhammad launched his great attack to break through to the Mediterranean. The map on the right shows all the great cities of his new Islamic Muslim empire. And we see in the top left corner, the city of Petra. The city of Petra was the only city that blocked his route to expand to the Mediterranean and to conquer the Byzantine Empire. Well, the famous Battle of Tabuk fought in the outskirts of Petra resulted in a resounding defeat for the rising Muslim empire, the first great defeat of the Muslim empire. Well, shortly later, 2 years later, the Arabs reorganized and launched a second attack. And in 632, they broke through the defenses of the Byzantine Empire. 637, they took Jerusalem, then they went south into Egypt. And by 718, they had expanded the whole way across to Spain. And finally, the last remnant of the Roman Empire, the city of Constantinople, fell in 1453. So for the history of the first centuries, the city of Petra was the key. The city of Petra was the only city which blocked the expansion of the Muslim empire. Well, the Crusaders, of course, realized that if they were ever going to keep control of Palestine and Jerusalem and Nazareth and Bethlehem, they were going to have to conquer Petra, a fortress city that would keep the Arabs locked into the Arabian Peninsula. So in 1115, the Crusaders built a giant fort on the outskirts of Petra. Once again, it's a place not often visited by tourists, or you just view it on the bus. This is called Shobat Castle, or the Cat of Montreal, built by the French Crusaders to protect the Crusader Empire. Well, the Crusader Empire, as we know, lasted a couple hundred years, and then gradually the Arabs nibbled away at it, and Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Nazareth, and Petra fell once again to the Muslims. Well, with the rise of the Islamic Empire, once they had conquered Petra and taken over the lush cities of Gaza and Alexandria and Haifa and Jerusalem, Petra was no longer important. And it started gradually receding from history. And so that's really part of its charm today. People don't realize how important it was in history. It's only when you get a good guide to Petra and you realize how important it was for the transition of Judaism from temple to synagogue, the rise of Christianity, and the rise of Islam, all into this stew that was the city of Petra. Well, today, all of that is long forgotten, except for people like me who sit around and read a history of Petra rather than going out and getting drunk when I got back to Amman. But you can see the charm is really reflected in, for example, some of the magnificent nighttime displays where the lights and sound and light shows really make the city come alive. Well, Petra was pretty well forgotten for centuries. It was sort of an oddity out in the desert, and very much like Machu Picchu and Angkor Wat was a forgotten city waiting to be discovered by Europeans. It was the Swiss explorer Johann Ludwig Burckhardt who discovered the city. His famous book of 1812, Travels in Syria and the Holy Land, really revealed the city once again to Europeans. French travelers started going there. Of course, back then it was not people like me staying in hostels and riding on buses. When Noël Desverges Frères from Paris arrived, they didn't have cameras or anything, and so they'd have to spend time sketching the ruins of Petra. And along with the great stories and legends and myths of Angkor Wat and Machu Picchu, the legends of Atlantis and the ancient civilization of Mu and great Zimbabwe in Africa, Petra was discovered. Well, it is now very much of a tourist destination. They have some very good archaeological tours. I know Harvard organizes archaeological tours of Petra, where you spend a couple of weeks and really get a good depth understanding of it. In 2019, the famous Petra Museum was opened. You can see the picture at the bottom, and it was recognized by UNESCO as one of the great heritage sites of humanity. But it is always and remains an abandoned city, the city of mystery. See the book on the right, the rose red city, half as old as time. Well, it is rose red. It is mysterious. Why would they build a city so isolated? Well, another part, when you do an archaeological tour, they point out the elaborate system of reservoirs and of channels, which made the city into an oasis of greenery, supporting fields of wheat, of olive trees, of vegetables, of animals, of sheep and camels. It was a city surrounded by fields because of a very elaborate and sophisticated water system. Today, you see the ruins of it. But it is one of those great mysterious cities, the ruins of Angkor Wat, shrouded by the jungles for so long. Machu Picchu, lost at the top of the Andes, forgotten for so long. The great cities of the Yucatan, once again, surrounded by jungles and lost. The great stone cities of Zimbabwe in Africa, entire cities and walls built out of stone, totally abandoned. Whatever happened to these great civilizations? A lot of stories have been written about it. There's a whole library of books on the history of the Rose City, Petra, the true and surprising history of the lost city of stone, entire library of books. Well, of course, Indiana Jones and the Lost Crusade was filmed at the great ruins. I know when I was in Amman, I was staying at one of my usual cheapo hostels, and every night after dinner at 8 o'clock, they would have a showing of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. And all of us would sit around drinking cheap Jordanian beer, tourists from all over the world. and we would watch it. And then we'd say, and tomorrow I'm going there. The other half of the group would say, we were there yesterday. It is every bit as dramatic as Indiana Jones portrays it. Now, of course, don't go to Indiana Jones and the Lost Crusade for an accurate account. I mean, a lot of the interiors were totally designed by Hollywood, but still the dramatic views of the exterior are authentic. The Mummy Returns, again, filmed in among the ruins. Once again, we don't know much about the people and stuff, and so you can say almost anything in Hollywood and it will make perfectly good sense. So that brings us to an end. On the left, you see the mobs of tourists. I'll tell you, that's one of the great things about traveling during the age of COVID-19. Everywhere I went in Paris, I had plenty of room. Even the flight, I took Icelandic Air back and forth. On both trips, I had 5 seats to myself. I just laid down and just slept and watched movies, and no cramped leg room or anything. A new thing which somebody told me about, which I didn't do, were the aerial balloons, which are quite a thrill, but they do give you an overall aerial view, which for so long could only be gotten by taking an airplane and flying over it. But with the aerial view from the balloon, you can it's pointed out the areas where there were fields of wheat, groves of olive trees, villages of farmers, herds of goats and sheep and camels up on the top on the plateau, which most people completely are unaware that it existed. So that brings us to an end. Once